Lützen, Saxony, November 16, 1632. A dense fog blankets the field, so thick that soldiers can barely see 10 feet ahead. The Protestant army of Sweden is locked in a brutal, grinding battle against the Catholic imperial forces of the Holy Roman Empire. Cannon fire rips through the mist. Cavalry charges vanish into the gray and reappear as chaos. The morning drags on, and the fog refuses to lift. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, the Lion of the North, the savior of the Protestant cause, is leading a cavalry charge on the right wing. He rides ahead of his men, as he always does, but in the fog and the smoke, he becomes separated. Imperial cavalry appear, shots ring out. His horse takes a bullet and stumbles. The king falls. When the fog finally lifts, the battle is over, and the Swedes have won, but Gustavus Adolphus is dead on the ground, stripped of his armor by enemy soldiers, his body riddled with wounds. He was 37 years old. He had taken a small, cold country on the edge of Europe and made it a great power. He had revolutionized warfare. He had stepped into the largest religious war in European history and changed its course. And now, on a muddy field far from home, the lion was gone. What he built would outlive him for a century, and the questions his reign forced Sweden to ask about power, about neutrality, about what a small nation can become are still being asked today. Welcome back to Beyond the Swedish Postcard. We've been moving through the Vasa dynasty, from Gustav Vasa's Iron Fist to Eric XIV's madness to the ship that sank before it ever left the harbor. And you might be thinking, especially after that last episode, that the Vasa story was mostly tragedy, that the dynasty was more a cautionary tale than triumph. But the Vasa dynasty also produced the greatest king Sweden ever had. A man who took a poor, sparsely populated country on the margins of Europe and made it a superpower. A man whose military innovations changed the way wars were fought for centuries. A man whose state building laid the foundations of modern Sweden. His name was Gustavus Adolphus. They called him the Lion of the North. And this is his story. Gustavus Adolphus became king in 1611. He was 16 years old. His father, Karl IX, had died suddenly, leaving the throne to a teenager. And that teenager inherited not one, not two, but three ongoing wars: Denmark, Poland, and Russia, all at the same time. Sweden was broke, exhausted, and surrounded by enemies. The Kalmar War against Denmark was going especially badly. The Danes had seized the vital fortress of Ellsbury, Sweden's only port on the west coast, cutting off access to the North Sea and Atlantic trade. A weaker king might have crumbled, but Gustavus Adolphus learned fast. He negotiated peace with Denmark in 1613, even though it cost Sweden a massive ransom to get Ellsbury back. It was a humiliation on paper, but it bought him time. Then he turned east to Russia. The Treaty of Stolbovo in 1617 cut Russia off entirely from the Baltic Sea. Sweden gained the province of Ingria, the land where St. Petersburg would later be built, and locked Russia out of European trade for a century. The strategic vision was already there: control the Baltic coast, own the trade routes, keep the enemy landlocked. The boy king was now a young man, and he was just getting started. Here's what made Gustavus Adolphus different from every other king of this era. He understood that Sweden could not win by size. It had to win by being smarter. Sweden in the early 1600s had a population of maybe 1.2 million people. France had 20 million. The Holy Roman Empire had even more. Sweden was poor, cold, and far from the centers of European power. But what it had was iron, timber, and a king who thought like an engineer. Gustavus Adolphus completely revolutionized the Swedish army. He didn't just make it bigger. He made it better in ways no one had seen before. First, combined arms. Most armies at the time treated infantry, cavalry, and artillery as separate forces that happened to be on the same battlefield. Gustavus Adolphus trained them to fight together. Infantry held the line, cavalry punched through weak points, artillery softened up the enemy, and protected the flanks. It sounds obvious now. At the time, it was revolutionary. Second, mobile artillery. Gustavus Adolphus introduced light field cannons, some of them made of leather wrapped copper, believe it or not, that could be moved by a few men or a single horse. Traditional siege cannons took hours to reposition. His guns could be reloaded and fired 3 times faster than anything the enemy had. That speed changed the math of every battle. Third, infantry tactics. Swedish soldiers fought in linear formations, not the massive squares other armies used. They advanced in rows, fired devastating volleys at close range, and then charged with pikes. It required discipline and nerve, and it shredded enemy formation. And fourth, a national conscription system. Rather than relying entirely on expensive mercenaries, Gustavus Adolphus built a system where every province was required to provide a certain number of soldiers. These were free men, not serfs, fighting for their country, not just for pay. Their morale was higher, their loyalty was stronger. The system would become a foundation of Sweden's military for centuries. This was the lesson Gustavus Adolphus taught, and it's one that still resonates today. A small country cannot outspend its enemies. It has to overthink them. Innovation isn't a luxury. It's a survival strategy. With Russia neutralized, Gustavus Adolphus turned to Poland. The Polish conflict was personal. The king of Poland was Sigismund III, Gustavus Adolphus's cousin. Sigismund had been king of Sweden briefly before being deposed by his uncle Karl IX, Gustavus Adolphus's father, for being Catholic. Sigismund never accepted the loss of the Swedish crown, and his Vasa dynasty still ruled Poland, making him a permanent threat on Sweden's eastern flank. From 1617 to 1629, Gustavus Adolphus campaigned in Livonia and Prussia, gradually seizing control of the Baltic coast. He captured Riga in 1621. He fought brilliant mobile campaigns, using his new army tactics to outmaneuver Polish forces that were often more heavily armored and more numerous. By 1629, the Truce of Altmark gave Sweden control of nearly the entire Baltic coastline. Riga, Danzig, Königsberg, modern-day Kaliningrad, the great trading ports, all paid duties to the Swedish crown. The grain and timber that flowed through those ports funded the treasury. The Baltic was becoming a Swedish lake. This was empire building, but not in a traditional sense. Sweden wasn't trying to conquer vast inland territories. It was trying to control the economic arteries of Northern Europe, the ports, the trade routes, the customs houses. That focus on trade and revenue rather than raw territorial expansion was another Gustavus Adolphus innovation. He understood that power in the long run ran on money. By 1630, the 30 Years' War had been tearing the Holy Roman Empire apart for 12 years. What had started as a religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants had spiraled into a continent-wide struggle for power. The Catholic Habsburg emperors, backed by Spain, had crushed the Protestant rebellion in Bohemia. They had defeated Denmark. The Protestant cause was collapsing, and the Edict of Restitution in 1629 ordered the return of all church lands seized by Protestants since 1552. It was a sweeping victory for the Catholic side. In June 1630, he landed on the coast of Pomerania, today's northern Germany and Poland, with only about 13,000 men. 13,000, that's a small army even by the standards of the time. But Gustavus Adolphus had two crucial advantages. The first was his reformed army, the most modern fighting force in Europe. The second was French money. Cardinal Richelieu, Catholic mastermind behind the French foreign policy, was subsidizing a Protestant king to weaken the Habsburgs. Pure, cynical, realpolitik. Gustavus Adolphus presented himself as the savior of Protestantism, and he meant it genuinely. His faith was deep and sincere, but he was also protecting Swedish interests. A Habsburg-dominated Baltic coast would strangle Swedish trade and threaten the empire he was building. Religion and strategy were never separate for him. The landing in Pomerania was the pivot point. Sweden stepped into the European stage as a great power, and the war changed course. The first major test came at Breitenfeld near Leipzig in September 1631. The Imperial Army, commanded by the veteran General Tilly, was confident. The Imperials had never lost a major battle. They had crushed every Protestant force they faced. And when the battle began, their confidence seemed justified. The Saxon allies of Sweden, fighting on Gustavus Adolphus's left flank, broke and fled almost immediately. The Swedish army was exposed. Tilly's forces surged forward, expecting a rout, but the Swedish line held. Gustavus Adolphus's infantry absorbed the Imperial attack, while his cavalry circled around and captured the enemy artillery. Then the Swedish cannons opened fire on Imperial ranks at close range. The leather guns, those quick reloading mobile pieces, did their deadly work. The Swedish cavalry countercharged. By the end of the day, the Imperial army was shattered. Tilly fled. The myth of imperial invincibility was gone. Breitenfeld changed everything. Across Protestant Europe, bells rang and bonfires burned. The Lion of the North had arrived. Gustavus Adolphus was no longer just a Swedish king. He was a European hero. He swept through Germany, taking city after city. He wintered in Mainz, living like a Renaissance prince, planning the next campaign. For a brief, dazzling moment, it seemed like he might remake the entire political order of Central Europe. The imperial forces regrouped. The emperor recalled his most formidable commander, Albrecht von Wallenstein, a brilliant and utterly ruthless mercenary general. Wallenstein raised a new army and began to push back against the Swedish advance. The two armies met in the small town of Lützen in Saxony on November 16, 1632. The weather was terrible. Fog blanketed the field, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Gustavus Adolphus, leading from the front as always, took command of the right wing and led a cavalry charge into the Imperial lines. In the fog and gun smoke, he was separated from his escorts. Imperial horsemen closed in. A shot shattered his arm. Another struck his back. He fell from his horse. A final pistol shot fired at close range and ended his life. The Swedish army, enraged by the death of their king, fought on with a fury that surprised even Wallenstein's hardened troops. They won the battle, but the cost was incalculable. When the fighting stopped, Gustavus Adolphus's body was found on the field, stripped of his armor and clothing. He was carried back to Sweden in a long, sorrowful funeral procession that stretched across Germany and the Baltic. At Nyköping, his heart was placed in a silver box and kept by his widow. His body was laid to rest in Riddarholmen Church in Stockholm, where it remains today. The lion was dead, and Sweden had lost the one man who could hold the entire enterprise together. But here's the thing about great leaders. If they've done their job, the system outlives them. Gustavus Adolphus left behind a brilliant chancellor, Axel Oxenstierna, who stepped into the gap and kept Sweden in the war. At the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the 30 Years' War, Sweden walked away with vast territorial gains in northern Germany. It became the guarantor of the peace. With a permanent seat at the table of European powers, Sweden, that small, cold country on the edge of everything, was now an empire. Gustavus Adolphus didn't just win battles, he built institutions. He founded Gothenburg in 1619, giving Sweden a west coast port that couldn't be blockaded by the Danes. He reformed the administration of the state, making it more efficient and centralized. He supported education, founding schools and strengthening Uppsala University. His reign marked the beginning of Sweden's stormskistig, its era as a great power. And the contrast with the Vasa ship, which we talked about the last episode, is striking. That ship sank before it ever saw battle, a monument to overreach. But Gustavus Adolphus took a nation that was just as top-heavy with ambition and made it float. He learned, he adapted, he succeeded on a scale no one had imagined. So what does a king who died nearly 400 years ago still matter? What does Gustavus Adolphus have to say to us now? First, he proved that a small nation can become something far bigger than its size suggests. Sweden in the 1600s was poor, cold, and sparsely populated. It had no business becoming a great power. but through innovation, discipline, and strategic clarity, it did. That DNA, the idea that Sweden punches above its weight, runs through the country's self image to this day. It's why Sweden leads in technology and design and in diplomacy. It's the legacy of knowing that you can't outnumber your rivals, so you have to outthink them. Second, his reign is the moment when the modern Swedish state began to take shape. The centralized administration, the national conscription system, the partnership between church and crown and schools. All of this was accelerated under Gustavus Adolphus. The Sweden that would later build the welfare state the folkhemmet started here, with a king who understood that the military strength required a functioning, educated society behind it. You cannot have a strong army with a weak country. That principle never went away. Third, and perhaps most relevant right now, there's a question of neutrality and alliances. For 2 centuries after the Napoleonic War, Sweden defined itself by neutrality. It stayed out of 2 world wars. It built its identity around being a peacemaker, a mediator, a voice for the globe. But in March 2024, Sweden joined NATO. The Russian invasion of Ukraine changed the calculus. A small nation on the Baltic watching a hostile power to the east deciding that standing alone isn't enough anymore. Gustavus Adolphus recognized that as logic instantly. He allied with France against the Habsburgs. He built coalitions with German Protestant princes. He knew that neutrality was a luxury you can only afford if someone else was willing to guarantee it. The decision to join NATO is, in a way, a return to strategic thinking that made Sweden a great power in the first place. Not aggression, but alliance. Not conquest, but security. Finally, there is the man himself. Gustavus Adolphus wasn't just a general. He was a reformer, a builder, a person of genuine faith who tried to reconcile his beliefs with the brutal demands of power. He was not perfect. His wars killed tens of thousands. His empire building extracted wealth from occupied territories. History is never clean, but his combination of vision, competence, and moral seriousness set the template for what a Swedish leader could be. He's not just a statue on a pedestal. He's a reminder that a country's trajectory can change in a single generation, for better or for worse. The Lion of the North died at 37 on a foggy field far from home, but the Sweden he built survived him for a century as a great power. His military reforms changed warfare, his state building changed a nation, and his strategic choices echo in the decisions Sweden is still making today, right now, about where it stands in the world and who it stands with. Next week, we meet his daughter, Queen Christina, a woman who grew up in the shadow of the lion, inherited the empire he built, and then did the unthinkable. She walked away from the throne. That is a story about identity, about faith, about the cost of being different in a world that demands conformity. She is one of the most fascinating figures in Swedish history, and I cannot wait to tell you more about her. If you are enjoying this podcast, it would mean so much if you shared it with someone who's also trying to figure this country out. And if you haven't followed or subscribed yet, hit that button so you don't miss what comes next. And keep looking beyond the Swedish postcard. Tack så mycket for listening. Hej då for now.